There's nothing inherently sinister about a crypt. 200 years of horror fiction have taught us to see stone vaults and iron doors as warning signs, not architecture. We've learned almost instinctively that when we see a name carved into marble or a heavy gate sealed shut, that something terrible must be hiding behind it. Crypts are where vampires sleep, where curses linger, where secrets get locked away for a reason. Those images are so deeply baked into our cultural imagination that we barely even question them. The word crypt itself feels like a warning. Even if you've never seen one in real life, your brain may fill in the blanks with flickering torchlight, damp stone, and something moving in the dark. Horror didn't just give us monsters, it gave us a visual language for death, and crypts became one of its most recognizable symbols. But if you step back and look at real history, that fear is pretty new. For most of human history, burial beneath a church wasn't about hiding the dead. It was about keeping them close. People weren't sent off to quiet parks at the edge of town. They weren't placed in manicured cemeteries meant to soften the reality of what had happened. They were laid to rest beneath the floorboards, tucked into vaults beside the sanctuary, and woven directly into the heart of daily life. You prayed above them, you sang above them, and you gathered with your community above them. It was practical, yes, but it was also deeply emotional, communal, intimate. The dead weren't gone. They were still part of the family. They quite literally held the church up, forming a foundation of ancestors that the living walked over, prayed over, and sang above. Every footstep was a reminder of who came before you. Every service took place over generations of memory. Death wasn't hidden away, it was integrated. A crypt only becomes spooky when we forget how it was meant to be read. For most of human history, people did not think of the dead as something that needed to be hidden or sanitized. Death was not outsourced to professionals in quiet buildings far from everyday life. It happened in homes. It happened in beds. And it happened with family gathered around. Children saw it, elders prepared for it, and bodies were washed, dressed, and watched over by the same people who had known them in life. Crypts existed within that worldview. They were not built to lock death away. They were built to give it a place that was orderly, sacred, and close. When a community placed its dead beneath a church, it was making a statement. These people still belong here. Their presence matters. Their memory is part of our spiritual foundation. In Catholic tradition especially, physical remains carry deep meaning. Bones are not just bones. They are relics. They are evidence of a life lived in devotion. They are reminders that holiness was once embodied in real flesh. That is why saints are not buried anonymously. They are placed where the faithful can come near them, touch their tombs, pray beside them, and remember them. To a medieval or early modern Christian, proximity to the dead was not frightening. It was reassuring. It meant continuity. It meant that the living and the dead still existed in relationship with one another. Modern culture, however, does not see death that way. We are taught to fear it, to avoid it, to treat the body as something disturbing once life has left it. We move the dead quickly, we seal them away, we cover them with layers of technology and ritual designed to soften the reality of what has happened. So, when we encounter a crypt today, especially one that allows us to see inside, it collides violently with everything we have been taught. It feels like a violation, a trespass, something that should not be happening in public view. That emotional reaction is not proof that something is wrong with the crypt. It is proof that something has changed in us. The tomb of Prince Gallitzin sits right at the intersection of those two worlds. It was built by people who still understood death as part of daily life. but it is now visited by people who have been trained to experience death only through distance and discomfort. That gap creates tension. When we look through the viewing windows into his vault, we are not just looking at a coffin. We are looking at a collision between two different cultural understandings of what death is supposed to be. One says, this is a sacred place of memory. The other says, this is something that should not be seen. And when we don't have the language to explain that collision, we fill the silence with fear. That's how a shrine starts to feel like a prison, and how reverence starts to feel like something darker. When you visit the tomb of Prince Demetrius Augustine Gallitzin in Loretto, Pennsylvania, it's easy to feel a little uneasy. There's a body behind glass. It's underground. It's dark. The stone is damp, and the air feels heavy. But that unease doesn't come from the grave. It comes from us. Modern culture has lost the instruction manual for these places. When we see a body, we think macabre. We think morbid. We even think wrong. But to the people who built that tomb, a body meant something very different. It meant family. It meant memory. It meant belonging. And it meant that the person you loved was still near. This isn't a ghost story, though ghosts do brush up against it. This is the story of how a Russian prince ended up buried in Appalachian soil. It's the story of the wizard clip, a haunting so strange it turned a skeptic into a believer. And it's the story of how a tomb meant for reverence slowly became something people started to fear. To understand the grave, one must understand the man inside it. If you walk past the tomb today, you'll see the word prince carved into the stone. It almost feels like a nickname, something maybe a quirky local might have given himself. It doesn't quite match the quiet mountain town around it. But Demetrius Gallitzin was the real thing. He was born in The Hague in 1770. His father was a Russian prince with Lithuanian roots, serving as a diplomat in one of Europe's most powerful courts. His mother was a German countess who moved through the most exclusive intellectual circles on the continent. Try to picture the world he came from. This was at the height of the Enlightenment, a time when science, reason, and philosophy were supposed to explain everything. His parents were friends with Voltaire and Diderot, the men who were trying to rewrite how the Western world understood God, humanity, and reality itself. Religion was being challenged. Superstition was being ridiculed. Logic was king. Demetrius grew up surrounded by globes, telescopes, and maps. French was spoken in gilded parlors. Silk brushed against heated marble floors. Philosophy was debated over tea and candlelight. He was being raised for power, trained to become a general or a diplomat in the court of Catherine the Great. His future was supposed to be rich, comfortable, and rational. And then he boarded a ship. At 22, he was sent on a grand tour, the ultimate gap year for wealthy young men. It was meant to be the final polish on his education before returning to a life of influence and prestige. He arrived in Baltimore, Maryland, in a country that was still figuring out what it even was. America in 1792 was raw, messy, and spiritually chaotic. There were no rigid structures like there were in Europe. Catholicism, Protestantism, mysticism, and skepticism all collided here in a strange, unsettled mix. Churches sprang up besides taverns. Preachers debated in the streets. Faith was loud, emotional, and often contradictory. And something about that chaos cracked him open. Against everything he had been taught, against the Enlightenment ideals of his family, Demetrius converted to Catholicism. and he didn't do it quietly. He entered the seminary. When the news reached Russia, it was a disaster. His father was furious, and the empress was insulted. Orders were sent demanding he return home and join the army where he could be corrected and controlled. But Demetrius said no, and just like that, it was all gone. The inheritance, the title, the palace, the servants, and the heated marble floors, all of it. He took the name Augustine Smith to hide who he had been. In 1795, he became the first priest to receive all his holy orders in the United States. And instead of staying in Baltimore, where life could have been relatively comfortable, he went west, into the Allegheny Mountains. If you've never been there, you need to understand what that meant in 1799. This wasn't rolling countryside. This was a wall of forest, thick, dark, and isolating. Winters that could kill you. Mud that could swallow a wagon whole. No railroads and no easy way out. This was the frontier. The man who had grown up surrounded by silk now lived in a drafty log cabin. He called his settlement Loretto, but it wasn't a town yet. It was a survival camp carved out of wilderness. In places like this, a priest wasn't just a preacher. He was the doctor, the lawyer, the emergency contact when everything went wrong. Gallitzin rode hundreds of miles through blizzards to reach dying parishioners. He broke bones falling from horses and still climbed back on. He spent everything he had buying land for poor immigrants so they wouldn't starve. He was dragged into court for debt. He lost his teeth to malnutrition, and by 50, his body was wrecked. The locals called him the priest of the Alleghenies. Back in Russia, he was remembered as a madman who threw away an empire for mud. And this is where the story turns strange. The frontier wasn't just dangerous. It was liminal, a place where reality felt thinner, where the rules of the old world no longer quite applied. And that's where the wizard clip enters. In 1797, a farmer named Adam Livingston began experiencing something he couldn't explain. Horses galloping in the night, logs jumping out of the fire, and most disturbingly, fabric, clothing, bedding, and tablecloths sliced into crescent shapes as if by invisible scissors. That's why it was called the wizard clip. Livingston dreamt of a man in black robes who could help him. That man turned out to be Father Gallitzin. And here's the thing. Gallitzin was a skeptic. He was raised on Enlightenment logic. He went to Livingston's home expecting to expose a hoax. Instead, he stayed for 3 months. He later wrote that no lawyer ever examined witnesses more strictly than he did. And still, he was forced to believe what he saw with his own eyes. Gallitzin later wrote that what he witnessed in Livingston's home was not divine, not holy, and not harmless. But it also wasn't just cheap stage magic. What disturbed him the most was how convincing it was. He believed Livingston was using psychological manipulation, misdirection, and emotional control, not to summon spirits, but to manufacture belief. To make ordinary people feel as though they were standing in the presence of something beyond explanation. And that, to Gallitzin, was far more dangerous than any ghost. To the people of the time, that made him something special. A man who stood between the ordinary world and the unknown and didn't flinch. So when people come to his tomb now, they aren't just visiting a priest. They're visiting someone who lived on the edge of belief. Gallitzin died in 1840. First, he was buried simply, as he wanted. Later, his remains were moved to places of honor, a process called translation. By 1899, the monument between the basilica and the rectory was built. And this is where modern discomfort kicks in. There are viewing windows into the tomb. To us, looking into a vault feels invasive. Horror movie gone wrong. But to the people who built it, it was an act of love. They wanted to remain close to the man who built their community. The architecture may look like a prison to us, but it was meant to be a shrine. People report lights, cold air, and cameras malfunctioning. Maybe. But 200 years of grief, prayer, and memory live in that soil. Is it haunted, or is history just echoing? Prince Gallitzin isn't a monster. He's a Russian aristocrat who found God in the Pennsylvania mud. The unease we feel doesn't come from him, it comes from us. There's no monster in the crypt, just a man who is finally getting to rest. If you enjoyed this deep dive into how a simple church crypt became something people no longer know how to read, make sure to like, subscribe, and follow along. And if folklore-driven history is your thing, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Next time, we're stepping into the 1800s, into a world so terrified of being buried alive that people began building machines to fight the grave itself. Bell cords, air tubes, and escape hatches, all designed to prove you were really dead. Because sometimes the most frightening things we create aren't born from ghosts or legends. They're born from fear. Stay curious, stay spooky, and I'll see you in the next strange story.